Hello, welcome to MOT 115, Healthcare in a Transcultural Environment. Today we're going to be talking about the stumbling blocks one encounters when attempting to communicate with other cultures. So, barriers to transcultural communication in healthcare include, and we're going to cover most of these, lack of knowledge, fear and distrust, racism, bias and ethnocentrism, stereotyping, ritualistic behavior, language barriers, and different perceptions and expectations. So let's start off with the lack of knowledge. Lack of knowledge often results in misinterpreting a patient's attempt to communicate. It is imperative that the healthcare worker learn what behaviors are appropriate or inappropriate based on the patient's culture. And over on the left we have what's called the iceberg principle, and it's basically an idea of what we're aware of and what we're not aware of. So we're aware we can observe behavior, the practices that they engage in, the products they use, but under the surface is the stuff that we're not always aware of, and that includes their values, their belief systems, the assumptions they make. And what you have to do, no matter what job you're moving into, is understand that people are a lot more complicated than they may appear on the surface. So it's important to be aware that there's all this stuff going on under the water that is definitely impacting how you communicate with them. Then we have fear and distrust. Rothenberger has identified 7 stages a person goes through when interacting with a new culture. The first one, fear. Many people feel threatened when they don't understand something. For many people, different equals dangerous. So, there's always people who complain about a particular racial minority or a sexual orientation or a particular religion, and they don't like it because they don't understand it and they're afraid of it. So there's a lot of issues that come into fear. Number 2, dislike. People do not like it when others communicate or act differently than the norm. And this is one of those things where you get into an elevator and everybody turns around and faces the door. Well, get into an elevator and face everybody else, trying to make eye contact. Well, they're going to be all freaked out and think you're a weirdo. So, dislike often comes from somebody who just doesn't follow the norms of this particular society. Then we have distrust. People are suspicious of other cultures' actions and motives because they don't understand a different culture's perspective. So, for example, when a woman in the United States decides to wear a burqa, which is that head-to-toe covering for Islamic women, American culture kind of looks at that and goes, why is this woman subjugating herself to some, 1400-year-old religion? But on the other hand, she has very specific reasons. And you have to learn to accept those reasons even if you don't understand them. But you should make an attempt to understand, because that's where distrust begins to dissolve, is when you begin to understand. Number 4, acceptance. When 2 people from different cultures begin to share experiences in a positive way, they will begin to respect one another. So, and in sociology, there's a phenomenon known as, the more familiar you are with a particular group, the less you fear and distrust them. So, for example, you may never have met a gay person, but over the course of a couple years, you might have met 1 or 2, seem totally normal. You totally think, wow, they're just like everybody else. And that's exactly the point, is when you get to know somebody, you realize that despite whatever you might have thought about them, everybody is pretty much one of those normal persons. There are always going to be serial killers, murderers, rapists, etc. But the vast majority of us are just normal people who want to go home at the end of the day and snuggle with our cat, dog, and love muffin. Number 5, respect. People from different cultures begin to admire one another. Acceptance and admiration equals respect. And of course, again, once you accept a person, you begin to admire them because you see the struggles that they have endured to get to where they are. And that respect is then generated because you realize they haven't had the easiest time of it. Number 6, trust. When people from diverse cultures learn to depend upon one another, they develop a trust. So let's say that you are somebody who is not a big fan of Hispanic people, and you go to the doctors and you're really, really sick, and the only doctor available to see you is a Hispanic doctor. Well, they help you, they get you fixed up, you feel great afterwards, and then you develop that trust. Well, maybe I shouldn't be so distrustful or fearful of Hispanic people. Number 7, like. Cooperation and concentration on the things that bind people allow people to like one another, not just focusing on the differences. So once you get to know someone of a different culture, you begin to see that you have a lot more similarities than differences. That's the first thing. And then secondly, you begin to see how interesting their lives could be if you get to know more about them, and more importantly, that you could become friends with that person because you do have a lot in common. So let's talk about racism. And this is one of the big issues in the United States. According to Barbie, there are 3 different kinds of racism. The first is individual racism, discrimination because of a visible biological characteristic such as black skin or what we call Asian eyes. This is, for whatever reason, you don't like black people, you don't like Asian people, whatever it is, and you are just gonna not like them. Then there's cultural racism, where one group claims their cultural heritage is superior to another. So the Aryans, and these are Germans, persecuted the Jews because they saw them as an inferior race. Now, just to kind of give you a tiny bit of context, Aryans actually came from the Middle East. The area where Muhammad was visited by the Archangel Gabriel and wrote down the Quran is where Aryans were, but Hitler rebranded Aryans as blonde, blue-eyed, whitest of white people. So, first of all, he was completely wrong there. Second of all, it was a matter of let's pick a group to blame for everything. And that allowed Hitler to, rise in power because it was easy to hate a group that if everybody was on board, everybody was on board. It's like if you're a Philadelphia fan of the Eagles, there is one team you hate no matter what, and that is the Cowboys. So, we as a group, it's okay to hate a sports team, but, other people, not so much. And then finally, institutional racism. And this is when institutions manipulate or tolerate policies that unfairly restrict the opportunities of certain races, cultures, or groups. So, for example, segregated schools back in the 50s and 60s. And this doesn't go away. Up until just a few years ago, if you were arrested with cocaine, you probably got probation. If you were arrested with crack and you were an African American, you spent 5 years in prison. And this became such a big deal because when the Justice Department looked at the figures, it was extraordinary. And they had to go back and start looking at these policies because what is crack? It's cocaine. But who uses cocaine? It tends to be the white people. Who uses crack? Tends to be African Americans. So, this institutional racism then gets put in place, and from there, it just gets worse. For example, you have a prison record. You're going to have a hard time getting any future jobs. You have a drug conviction. Your financial aid opportunities are going to be limited. In terms of being jailed at a young age, you're basically limiting everything in your future. And oftentimes in communities where you have a certain level of racism, this inherent institutional racism has really turned most of the residents into unemployable, non-voting participants in society. And that's a big thing nowadays, is restoring voting rights for convicted felons, non-violent felons oftentimes, and other times that doesn't matter. Moving on to bias and ethnocentrism. Most people are biased toward their own culture and believe their values are right. This is called ethnocentrism. People who antagonize and alienate different cultures are ethnocentric. So when you were watching TV and they interview some guy who's got, he's got that traditional Southern look, that Confederate flag baseball cap, and he's chewing tobacco, and he's got the flannel on, and he's standing with his Ford F-150, and he's saying, well, I don't understand those northern people, they are just dumb. So the point is that no one is better than anyone else in a substantive way. We all have our value, and we all should be respected for the value we bring to our culture. But to denigrate one culture more than another is also very negative. So, what I just said about Southern people could be taken as ethnocentric because I'm from the Northeast, and I, of course, believe that people from the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast are superior. Not really. But the point being is, when we make these gross generalizations, what we're basically doing is eliminating the individual and categorizing them with some biases that we have created that society finds culturally acceptable. Simultaneous dual ethnocentrism is part of every interaction with a patient. Healthcare workers are assessing their patients, and the patient is judging the healthcare worker. So in this context, what we have to remember is it's not just you as the practical nurse, physical therapist assistant, CMA, whatever your healthcare job ends up being. This is something that you have to remember your patient is also doing. So they're looking at you, they're judging you. Do you look the part? Do you speak the part? Do you give them what they expect in a healthcare worker? And that is a huge part of why dress codes and behavioral codes are put in place, because you need to trust your healthcare worker. To overcome your biases, you must first acknowledge that they exist. A lot of people have problems with people who have accents. And, the reality is this person now knows more languages than you do probably. So 2, 3, 4 languages. And they are doing their best. And to be rude or impatient is just that. It's being rude, and you shouldn't do that because you're just going to make the patient hate you because you're not being sensitive to what they're going through. Moving on to stereotyping. These are unsubstantiated assumptions that all people of a certain culture are alike. So African Americans, and this is one of these things that is just priceless because I pulled it out of a media role survey. That basically somebody watched 168 hours of TV and wrote down every time they saw someone of a particular cultural group and what role they played. So African Americans in TV and movies generally play athletes, gang members, or police officers. That's an interesting dynamic. Arab Americans typically play terrorists, convenience store clerks. Asian Americans tend to play physicians, lawyers, CEO, or factory worker. Hispanic Americans almost always are playing gang members or factory workers. Irish Americans are often displayed as drunkards, police officers, or factory workers. Italian Americans, and Italians have been really mad about this for a long time, crime bosses, mobsters, gang members, but then you also have the restaurateurs. And then Jewish Americans are often portrayed as physicians, lawyers, CEOs, and teachers. So, the media roles that we are assigned oftentimes build the stereotypes that people have embraced. They see someone who's Irish American and immediately they're going to think, oh, when are they going to go have their whiskey? So then we also have gender stereotypes. And you have two pictures, the female brain, the male brain. The male brain is all about sex. The women's brain is all about chocolate, which may not be too far off some weeks. The point is that it's very dangerous to start stereotyping people because stereotypes, while they may have an element of truth, are generally derivative and they basically reduce a person to just a few characteristics that are not true. Most stereotypes tend to be negative. Although many people in a culture may have similar characteristics, it is not universal. Every person is an individual. Cultural blind spot syndrome. When a healthcare worker assumes there are no cultural or potential barriers to communication or care because they look and behave like you. In the same way, all white people are not the same. All Hispanic people are not the same. All African Americans are not the same. All Native Americans are not the same. So, if you are a white person and that the people who live, for example, in Wyoming, who are also white, they're definitely not the same as you. And it's the same thing. If you come from Haiti, you're going to have a much different perspective than somebody who comes from Aruba or Cuba. So stereotyping is very limiting in terms of how we see people. Then we have ritualistic behavior. Healthcare workers tend to be systematic in their level of care, but they need to adjust their behavior to the culture they are working with. For example, excluding family by the bedside during certain treatments may not be necessary. Unless there is a scientific or legal reason to conduct a ritual, consider being flexible. So you have to come in and do the BP, blood pressure and pulse and oxygen levels and all that kind of stuff. And instead of asking the family to step outside, ask yourself, is there any reason why I have to ask them to leave? And that's the difference between somebody who's worked in the field for a long time and somebody who is new. Somebody who is new is oftentimes going to follow the rules to the letter, whereas somebody who's been in the field for a long time knows what rules are flexible. Language barriers. These are the most obvious reason that we have problems with our communication, is we just do not understand the other person. And again, this is where things like nonverbal communication, pictures, things like that can really come into play. Different dialects and regionalisms also. Dialect is a distinctive way a language is spoken or written in a given locality or by a group of individuals. A regionalism is a word, phrase, pronunciation, or custom particular to a given region. So over here, now our college is located right outside of Philadelphia, and we see a lot of Philly slang. Birthday, breakfast, casina, chimley. That's one you hear all the time in the Philadelphia region, and it just makes some of us crazy. Center City, we never say downtown. We always say Center City to discuss where we're going in Philadelphia. CHOP, which is the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, but that's how everybody refers to it, as CHOP. Cuz, which is pretty universal in a lot of places. Coffee, which is the way to say it in the Philly region. Eagles are eagles. Icening, we have to add that extra N in. Ritas means water ice. And sandwich or sandwich is a sandwich. And wada or woda is our beloved H2O. So things that, represent in Philly may not represent in New York City, but, they're only 120 miles apart, give or take. The other thing is that this slang doesn't mean a person is stupid. It's just that they grew up in an area that they may have used different kinds of slang. And as such, it's a normal part of the dialect. Then we have idiomatic speech. And this is something you should try to avoid because it is very individualized to a culture. Idioms are slang or street talk. They are also expressions. Every subculture has its own idioms, and here's a few of them. What's wrong with Jenny? She's having a bad hair day. A bad hair day. Now, that could be minimizing someone's feelings or their importance, but, generally, if you're familiar with that idiom, there's no harm intended. Then there's, of course I want to know, I'm all ears. If you translate that into Ukrainian or French, it's going to sound like you have big giant ears. He rubs shoulders with famous people, meaning is he a massage therapist or does he just rub shoulders, hang out with? Whenever I have to speak in public, I get butterflies in my stomach. Again, if you were doing this as a proper translation from English into another language, it would sound like you have bugs in your belly. The reality, of course, is that we're just nervous. Next, we have a leg up on the competition. Again, that sounds like we're kicking people, but we're not. And then, last but not least, I know London like the back of my hand. And I guess the idea here is that we spend so much time looking at the back of our hands that we should be able to know every little piece of it. So, again, these idiomatic speech is very difficult for people who come to the United States and English is their second language to understand, and we should avoid them. Finally, we have different perceptions and expectations. When the healthcare worker and the patient misinterpret each other's messages. The bigger the cultural, behavioral languages difference between patients and healthcare personnel, the greater the probability that patients will misunderstand the treatment plan. And again, as a healthcare person, your job is to try and help the person feel better, get better, understand what they have to do to get better. Now, just a very gross yet brief explanation of how we look at these things. These are cockroaches on the right-hand side. In the United States, we see a cockroach, it's a pest. We're stomping on it, we're setting our husband or boyfriend to stomp on it. We're just grossed out by it. However, in China, they can be called pets. And in northern Thailand, crisp it up, you got yourself a nice little appetizer. So, that in and of itself will let you know how we all have different perspectives on things, the most common things. So, that's it for this week's presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to email or text your instructor. If you don't attend our college but still have a question, please leave a comment and we will respond as quickly as we can. Thank you and have a great day.